One Missed Call is a 2008 horror remake of a Japanese movie of the same name. This movie is talked about quite a bit on YouTube, and that's due to the fact that this movie is possibly the worst rated horror movie on Rotten Tomatoes.
We decided to investigate a little further into this movie by watching not only the American version, but the original Japanese version as well. We did this in an attempt to find out why the American version is hated so much more than the original. But before we present our findings of our investigation, I'm Inspector Keto.
And I'm Detective Mio.
And first, let's take a look at the behind the scenes.
While this American movie is a remake, the original 2003 Japanese version is considered quite derivative itself, taking large inspirations from movies such as The Ring, which we have not seen.
Now, I don't presume to know what the production team was thinking when they made this movie, but based off of all that we've read, I think it was something like this.
This Del Toro guy will be the perfect choice. He's the creator of Mimic and Pan's Labyrinth. Oh, and never mind, he's too busy directing a Hellboy sequel.
Oh, but Eric Valette having a few qualifications and looking into the future with the power of the internet, it seems like he will direct a crappy-looking horror movie about a car that eats people. Perfect.
Alright, looks like the director has decided to not watch the original movie as source material, and he has told the other actors to not watch the movie as well.
This seems like a perfectly reasonable idea. What could go wrong?
In all seriousness, if you're making an original take or reboot off of something, maybe ignoring the source material can help you be creative, but you have to have good creative ideas in the first place. And that is something that this movie does not have.
We need writers. What about writers? I got the original writers. That should be good. Maybe.
We need to add some America to this story. Let's go get Andrew Clavin. He has a few writing credits and he seems to have the proper qualifications.
How about we don't screen the movie for the critics, because that'll be sure to invoke confidence in the project.
In general, this seemed like a project that was only trying to capitalize on the second wave of the J-horror trend, without too much care and a little bit late to the party. So that's production out of the way, let's look at the movie itself.
And here we go. The movie begins with a woman on the phone. You should know, by the way, in this movie, phone calls kill people. Specifically ghost phone calls from yourself. She ends up dying along with her cat for some reason. I guess the cat overheard the phone call too. The movie loses points for killing off the animal for no reason. Next, we meet our main character, Beth. And lots of people that are thirsty and creepy. And this one guy is really, really weird.
Okay, we're gonna stop using the spooky voice now. If you want the spooky voice back for another video sometime, leave a comment down below.
Beth's friend gets a weird voicemail featuring her voice just before she dies. But her friend isn't dead yet, so that's pretty concerning.
There's also this guy named Jack who looks a lot like Ben Affleck and Paul Rudd combined. He finds a candy in a dead woman's mouth. Later we learn that this is his sister. At least I think it's his sister. This guy is very poorly written into the story, so he very rarely pops up.
The friend who got the voicemail dies by being thrown in front of a train, but before that point she kept seeing weird, ghostly, ghastly stuff. And when she finally does die, it's from cringe because the CGI is really, really bad.
Another friend of Beth, the creepy guy from earlier, dies after he sees some spooky stuff like centipedes. He dies via stabbing through the chest. Even the last thing he said something about his head not being screwed on, so missed opportunity for a sick joke.
Another friend of Beth named Taylor gets a call, but they both ignore their phones, and then some weird editing transition stuff happens. If we can find it, we'll go ahead and put a little bit of example here, but it's kind of weird.
The phone starts ringing even though the batteries are out of the phones, so both girls start breathing heavy because they're panicking.
Oh no!
The girls can't cancel their phone service, so they resort to stomping on it. And real quick, I'm going to jump ahead. When we compare this to the Japanese version, it is completely different. They just wipe the phone. In this case, they just dance on the phone, and it looks kind of ridiculous.
There's this TV guy who wants to go get Taylor on his show because he runs some kind of TV exorcism kind of thing. I don't think that all the actors in this movie are necessarily bad, but they all act very poorly. Either way, Beth doesn't let Taylor go, but eventually Taylor goes anyway.
Jack, the police guy, meets up with Beth and confirms that the calls did indeed happen. And for some reason, no other police officer has checked the phone records, so logic isn't very strong in this movie. Jack and Beth try to bust into a building where they think the first call in this chain of calls originated.
During the scene, Jack goes, "I can't bust in there, I'm a cop." And she goes, "Oh, I'm not." Which doesn't really make any sense because he would still arrest her, but then she fails to open the door, so he has to help anyway. And then she says, "I was getting it." Let's spoil it now. The original Japanese movie, there's not nearly as much romantic tension involved, but in this movie, it's quite intense.
Together they search the building and then they find a nanny cam after getting some fake jump scares.
Fake jump scares, by the way, is mostly where the horror element comes in with this movie.
Which one is it?
Besides the fake jump scares and actual real jump scares, there's just a bunch of like, oh, look, that person looks dead, or a bunch of creepy people and creepy effects and bad CGI. I think while making the adaptation, they just didn't know how to make it scary, and so all they knew how to do was go, look at that! But back to the story.
They can't figure out what's on the nanny cam, but they do figure out that the originator of the calls was from a woman named Mary, who had 2 daughters. Due to physical evidence dealing with the eldest daughter, Ellie, we are to assume that Mary was an abusive parent.
Taylor, the girl from earlier, ends up going on the TV show, and Beth and Jack rush there to try to stop her. However, before they can get to her, she's asphyxiated by the ghost.
It's interesting because before this point, the ghost was trying to make all the deaths seem like accidents and things, but in this case, she's just floating in the middle of the stage, and everyone can see her, but not the ghost. So how are the police supposed to explain this?
I'm here to tell you right now, we don't care.
Let me tell you something.
We don't care.
Jerry.
After Taylor dies, Beth is the next one to get a phone call, so now she's on borrowed time. Jack is frustrated by this situation and breaks the phone and drops into a fish tank, poisoning everything inside.
As mentioned before, there are themes of child abuse in this movie, and this comes in especially with Beth's backstory. That being that her mother was abusive and would put out cigarettes on her arms, and that his father herself, which is why I guess she's traumatized. Once again, another spoiler for what we'll talk about later, this theme is mixed in a lot better in the original Japanese version. Here it's just kind of slapped on there.
But in defense of this movie, I think the father himself is a little bit better than what they did in the Japanese version, where instead it's the grandmother himself, and the father just wasn't around a lot. Later, Beth and Jack go to go see a girl called Laura, who's the daughter of Mary, the parent mentioned from earlier, who isn't very helpful because apparently she's been traumatized by the alleged abuse.
Beth figures that she needs to find the body of Mary in the hospital that burned down earlier, forgot to mention that, whoopsie, and decides not to wait for Jack and enters the derelict building, all by herself.
After getting mopped across the floor by the ghost there, Jack finally arrives, but they're almost immediately separated once again.
Later, Beth encounters the dead body of Mary, which is now reanimated, and I guess things go okay. I mean, she lives.
But later we find out that it wasn't Mary who was hurting Laura, it was actually the other daughter, Ellie. And then Jack gets killed through a door, and the asthma ghost of Ellie attacks Beth. But then all of a sudden, ghost mom Mary pops up and saves her.
She sucks her into the phone, poof, and she's gone. Then we see Jack's phone dialing a phone number. Have no idea what that means. I sort of understand the plot of this movie a little bit better after we watched the original, which is a sign that you failed to make a good remake when I have to watch the original to figure out what the heck you were trying to do.
Hopefully that explains most of the story. Now we're gonna go on to the Japanese version and what that one did differently, and in some ways a lot better.
This movie is basically the same premise, but right off the bat, they don't show the first death that we got to see in the first movie, and it sort of leaves it up in the air as to whether or not that was an actual accidental death or something more sinister.
The first death that we get is, of course, the train death. It's a little bit better because the last one was so stupid. Also, it utilizes CGI a little bit less. Plus afterwards, instead of just having the girl's body there dialing the number, it's a disembodied hand, which makes the audience more intrigued.
The way people talk about this whole event going on in the movie, it's more like some kind of internet creepypasta or urban legend as opposed to some new mysterious happenings. It's less like the general public's trying to rationalize this and more like they're saying, oh, it's super creepy.
Another thing that's different in this movie is how the ghost operates. In the American movie, it seemed like the ghost was trying to make things look like accidents. But in this movie, it just wants people dead, to the point where it just drags this guy down an elevator shaft.
Trapping at the back street, running through the patch like a track meet.
Despite the lack of subtlety of the ghost movements, the horror element of this movie is much stronger than the American one because it utilizes subtlety. There's not a bunch of all over the place, and more small touches that make it creepy. It's kind of hard to explain without actually watching the movie yourself. In a lot of ways, the Japanese plot is a lot simpler. There aren't as many workarounds and extra things as there were in the American version, such as having to break into the apartment, that whole thing of like, I can't do that, I'm a cop and stuff. Or the scene where they try to cancel their phone plans and then end up destroying their phones. In the Japanese version, they just wipe the phones.
Which is interesting because this movie is like 30 minutes longer than the American movie. Yet, it doesn't really feel that way.
The character of the TV exorcism guy, when he pops up, is a lot better. It makes a bit more sense, and she goes with him immediately as opposed to not going with him and then going with him.
I think it just kind of works better with the flow of the movie.
In general, this movie is just easier to follow.
When the ghost exorcism finally pops up, it's definitely more extra. It's more disturbing, but also at the same time, it's more effective. In this case, she gets her head twisted off and her limbs broken, which kind of sounds a little corny, but still a little bit better than what they did in the remake.
The child abuse storyline just works a little bit better in this movie, as it actually ties into the story with the main character and the kind of decisions that she ends up making.
Plus also the scene that reveals why her trauma came about just works a little bit better.
There's a spooky moment with the ghost in a cabinet that is literally scarier than anything else I've seen recently, specifically than these two movies. It's not like a cheap jump scare or anything either.
I actually felt a little bit scared. Plus also, the atmosphere of the hospital scene is a lot better in this movie, as opposed to just, ooh, it's dark and scary. Actually ends up building up the tension. You do feel like you're alone in this abandoned hospital with angry ghosty ghosts.
Another scare happens when the ghosts reach around the door and then grabs the guy's arm. Well, that's pretty cool, you know, pretty subtle and everything. But the face kind of melding into the door was a bit of a misstep, I would say. And overall, while this movie isn't like the scariest movie or the best movie ever made or anything, the scenes that take place at the end are just far better handled. No cap, on another level. And in this movie, there's actually no explanation as to why the older sister was abusing the younger sister. I guess she's just an awful girl, which probably works better rather than trying to explain it with some weird occult thing as they did in the American one. So points there.
Skipping to the end of the movie, it's pretty different. As opposed to the guy being killed, he's, I guess, stabbed and then taken to the hospital, and the girl, the main character, is possessed by the ghost. It's just a really weird ending, and other stuff surrounding it is just odd. So I don't think this ending is necessarily better than the remake.
So, we're running on about 6 hours of sleep, so we're gonna have to cut this investigation short a little bit. Inspector Keto, what are our conclusions?
Well, the American remake has no need to exist. It doesn't have any original ideas, so they just end up retreading the same story, but just done in a worse manner.
And I feel the lack of familiarity with the source material probably led to several missteps in execution, and them just not understanding what the story was about.
Also, all the horror elements just kind of flop in this movie, whereas the other one had some pretty good jump scares, I guess you could call them. This one just has fake jump scares and, oh guys, look, ghosts and presumably dead people and I guess a demon baby.
One reason I think the gore and the horror is toned down in the American version is because it's rated PG-13 in an effort to appeal to the teens, which is pretty interesting because we're going to be making a video about the issues with PG-13 horror. So subscribe for that.
But until that video comes out, this investigation is over, but you can go check out this video over here. But until we see you there, he's Detective Mio.
And he's Inspector Keto.
And we hope you have a blessed day.
Bye!